welcome. So my name's Maggie Johnston. I work in education and university relations here at Google. So welcome to another installment of Authors at Google. And today we have Ben Wildavsky, who is a senior fellow in research and policy at the Kauffman Foundation and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institute. He's also a former educational editor for U.S. News and World Report, and a higher education reporter for San Francisco Chronicle. So he's here today to tell us about his new book, which is The Great Brain Race. The only tactical thing I wanted to mention is that when we get to the Q&A a part of the session, there's a microphone over there, and we want to try and make sure everything's recorded because we'll be putting this up on YouTube. So Ben, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Maggie, for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. My brother, Adam, who's here, is a Googler in the New York office, and so I've been there a few times. I've never been to the Googleplex. It's already looks like a wonderful place. And, you know, Google is one of the world's talent magnets, so that's something that I'll be talking about today, so I hope this will have some particular salience to all of you. And what I was told, you know, asking around in terms of what would really be effective for a Google audience, you know, obviously a sophisticated bunch, highly educated with a lot of skills. And I was told that the crucial thing was to start with pictures of cute animals. These are some monkeys that I came across when I was in Southeast India a couple of years ago. This is the edge of a national forest, and this is a place called, it's outside of Chennai, which used to be called Madras, and this is taken from the balcony of a guest house where I stayed. And you know, you see these monkeys are very adorable, but it turns out they have a dark side. I found out the day after I arrived that if you leave your room and you leave any of your windows open or the door open, they'll come in and they'll trash the place. So I guess that tells you things aren't always what they seem. And the same is true of this place. It's completely gorgeous. You know, not only are there monkeys, there's deer running around. There's these magnificent banyan trees everywhere. And it looks like a gorgeous, but a sort of a sleepy, out-of-the-way place. But it turns out this is the campus of an elite engineering school, the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. It's one of a chain of the IITs around the country. They're often called the MIT of India. Incredibly hard to get into. Only 2 or 3% of applicants make it in on this intense national exam. And not only is this out-of-the-way place home to this elite campus, it's also very much connected to the the new global network of knowledge and talent mobility that I'll be talking about a little bit more. My first day, as I usually do when I visit a campus, I went to see the president, known as the director, a guy named M.S. Ananth, right here, and he had just come back from Davos in Switzerland, this big international gathering of the world's elite every year, and he had just been taking part in a higher education working group that's headed up by Rick Levin, who's the president of Yale University. So this out-of-the-way place is actually very much connected to the global education marketplace that I'm going to talk about that's now developing. And as I was working on this, I should also mention, walking around the campus of this IIT, I went to the recruiting office, or the career office, where there's sign-up sheets for interviews, as you see in American campuses, and Google was there with a sign-up sheet, McKinsey was there with a sign-up sheet, and I walked down the same corridor and I saw a big poster advertising graduate scholarships at a place called KAUST. This is the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. It's a brand new university that's been created just last year in Saudi Arabia. They're trying to recruit the best in the world, so of course they're going everywhere, including to this corner of India. And as I was working on the book, I came across lots of scenes like this that were, to me, certainly to my Western eyes, somewhat unexpected, juxtapositions that I would not have thought of. And in fact, the whole book was really not what I expected to write. I went into this with an idea for a book excuse me, that would sort of be a Cook's tour of the world's great universities, you know, with maybe a chapter about some of the best, most interesting places out there. So the IITs were a stop on that tour. But I discovered after just working on this for a couple of months that I felt that I was really missing the real story, and the much more interesting story, which was really a shaking up, and is a shaking up of the old order of universities, a real change in who are the places that are at the top, and who are going to be the places that are at the top in the future. Now, I'm going to talk about what I think global higher education is, why I think it's important, why some people are worried about this, this whole phenomena of globalization, and why I think they shouldn't be worried, because in my view, what I call free trade in minds is really an opportunity for the world and not a threat. I'm going to talk about three main trends. One is huge academic mobility around the world, of students in particular and also of faculty increasingly. It's at a level we've never seen before. The second is a real quest everywhere from South Korea to Saudi Arabia to China to try to create very competitive universities that are world-class, that can compete with the best in the world. And the third is near and dear to my heart since, as Maggie mentioned in introducing me, I'm the former editor of the U.S. News and World Report College and Graduate School Guides, Rankings. Rankings have now become a global phenomenon. So I'm going to start just by telling you a little bit of what's happening in the world of mobility. The first thing to know is the numbers are huge. There are now 3 million globally mobile students studying outside their home countries. That's a 57% increase in just the last decade. And I should mention, these are not study abroad kids. These are not the semester or the summer program. That stat is only for students who are going overseas for a year or more. Many of them are degree-seeking students. Excuse me. There's a very big, these students are very eagerly recruited by universities, really for several reasons. At the elite level, the best graduate students, the best postdocs form the backbone of the research enterprise at the big research universities, so everybody wants the best. At the mass level, students, of course, are a source of human capital. A lot of countries want to have great students coming there. They also want the revenues because in many cases, foreign students pay full freight. Just as out-of-state students, for example, in California at the UC system, pay a lot more than in-state students. And the recruiting has gotten so intense that people have resorted to some unconventional methods. New Zealand, like Australia, is trying very hard to go after the Asian student market. So their higher ed promotion agency came out with a viral video a few years ago, and I thought the video might not be appropriate for this forum, but I have a still from the video, and you'll see that it shows a young couple sort of smooching in the corner of the hot tub, and then the camera pulls back, and you see this very stern, disapproving parents over in the other corner, and then you see the caption says, "Get further away from your parents." And this was a huge success. I think they had it out there for a month or two, and then they discreetly took it off. You can still find it if you Google hard enough. And what's remarkable is how successful it seems to have been, because if you look at the 10-year trend in student recruiting, New Zealand is actually number 2, second only to, I actually can't read from here. I think it's South Korea at the top. So I guess this shows you that marketing can really work. So mobility of students is one big phenomena. We know that academics, of course, are very mobile. Half of the world's top physicists no longer work in their home countries. We also see a lot of mobility of research, which you can define in various ways. I mean, just in terms of cross-border collaborations in scientific publishing, there's been a doubling of those collaborations since 1990, more than a doubling. You also have interesting new models developing. Yale University, for example, has a collaboration with some Chinese universities where each really takes advantage of their comparative advantage, as economists would say. Yale provides some high-level tenured professors, scientists, who go over to work in China with Chinese universities where there's very high quality and very cheap lab space. There are very highly trained techs, again, very inexpensive. The Chinese universities benefit from this great expertise that comes to them. And the U.S., gets the ability to do experiments on a scale and research on a scale that they can't do as easily or as cheaply back home. So it's really win-win, and I think that dynamic may change, as the skill set in China gets larger. But for the time being, it's really working very well. The other mobility example is, there's a disproportionate number of the best scientists have worked outside their home countries during their careers. Now, that is not necessarily causal. It may just be some kind of correlation. But I think it's striking that the global experience is so closely associated with the really excellent research. So a third kind of mobility is mobility of campuses themselves. And by that I'm talking about the phenomena of branch campuses or satellite campuses. This is when Western universities typically spread out and create outposts in the Middle East very often, also in Asia where there's huge demand for Western degrees. There are now 162 of these satellite campuses around the world. And again, that's a figure that's increasing very quickly. It's gone up 43% in just the past 3 or 4 years. There's just huge demand for Western-style universities. And one place that I visited is in Doha, in Qatar, and it's called Education City. This is a compound on the edge of the city, funded with a lot of money from the Qatari government. And places like Georgetown School of Foreign Service has set up a campus there. Northwestern's Journalism School, the Medill School, is there. Cornell's Medical School, the Weill School of Medicine, is there. And you'll see this is Texas A&M's campus. The buildings are incredibly lavish, marble all over the place. And again, you see these interesting juxtapositions. This massive tall door, probably twice the height of, 1.5 times the height of the room that we're in. It opens up, and you see 3 young women in black abayas from head to toe coming out. They're not veiled, but they have the traditional garment. And they walk out, but then if you look down the street, you can't see them in the slide, but you see these big banners that say, "Welcome to Aggie Land." And that's, of course, the kind of thing you see on the home campus in Texas and College Station. And they're really trying to bring a piece of Texas to the Middle East. So you walk into these buildings, you'll see the men's prayer room, the women's prayer room, but then you'll also see all kinds of Texas paraphernalia. You'll see fast food courts, and it's really a meeting of cultures. Interestingly to me, there's also an effort, I think, really very much encouraged by the host country here to bring in some liberalization and some of the values we associate. I mean classical liberalization. We associate with Western universities, including debate. So there's a debate series that's sort of in the tradition of the Oxford-style debates, and there were posters all over these campuses saying the next debate, the resolution was resolved. This House believes that Gulf Arabs value profit over people. And that's the kind of thing I wasn't expecting when I went over there. And I think that tells you that there really is an effort to push the envelope a bit. I talked to a guy at the Medill School of Journalism, and he was going around to the local newspapers and talking with them and saying, you know what, you don't have to put a picture of the emir on the front page every day, which was something new for them. So there is really an effort to spread the influence of Western universities, as I said, with encouragement from the host countries. Now, I've talked about all these kinds of mobility, and I think they're fascinating, but they have created a certain amount of anxiety. And I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples. One of the things that you hear a lot about, and I just talked to some Indonesian scholars a couple of weeks ago, and it's something they raised, is the question of brain drain. It's something that has been a worry in the developing world for some decades. Many of these countries don't have great education opportunities themselves. A lot of their best people go overseas to universities in the West, often in the States. We've been a huge magnet for foreign students since World War II. And the fear is that they'll go away, they won't come back, and people will lose their talent. And sometimes people take measures to try to prevent this, which I think are very ill-advised. Just a couple of years ago, the president of another one of these IITs in India, in Bombay, north of what's now called Mumbai, he basically said all the students who are very sought after for foreign internships in industry and also in academia, he said, you can't go overseas for internships anymore. I don't want to lose the talent. You got to stay home. And obviously this was very unpopular. And conversely, on the receiving end, mobility is sometimes viewed with suspicion or concern because people are worried about their own students being crowded out by foreign students. So in Malaysia, for example, they've put a quota of 5% on foreign students coming into their public universities. And even here in the States, we don't tend to be so restrictionist in explicit ways, but once in a while you'll hear of a quota like that. The University of Tennessee, as recently as 10 years ago, had a quota of 20% on foreign students in their graduate departments, whereas nationally in fields like engineering, computer science, as you all know, and here of any place else, you're aware that 65% of PhDs in those fields are foreign born. So people are worried about this. They take various measures to try to stop it or to slow it down. And my view is that we really should not worry about this kind of mobility. We should embrace it. It's really good for us. And the key insight here, I think, is that we're in a dynamic world in higher education. It's not a static world anymore. And the old patterns of mobility are changing. So, yeah, I mean, brain drain, I wouldn't say it's a non-issue. It's a problem for many countries. But we're starting to see new patterns as the world is changing. And I'll just mention that, in China, for example, with traditionally a big sending country, and India, also a big sending country, you're now seeing what sometimes will be called brain circulation. And so the idea is somebody might follow the traditional pattern of going to the West for a degree, but they might then go to another country for a second degree. And then as their economies are taking off, they're much more likely than before to come back home. They might work for a multinational, but they're able to do things that they did not always do. And excuse me, China, there's also, recruiting patterns are changing regionally. China now takes in more foreign students, mostly from Asia, than it sends overseas, which is contrary to the image that we have of China. People call this, as I said, brain circulation. I've heard the term brain trade, just to show how it's different from the migration of the past. And one wonderful example is a guy named, the faculty level, a guy named Chunfang Shi, who is ethnically Chinese, born in Singapore, goes to Canada for a master's, goes to Harvard for a PhD, becomes a very well-regarded material scientist. I believe that's his field. He goes to Brown University, becomes a tenured professor, very successful. So far, that's the traditional trajectory, brain drain for Singapore, a gain for the US, you might say. But in the new world, he gets recruited back to Singapore, to the National University of Singapore, which is trying very hard to upgrade itself. So he becomes the head of an institute there, and then he gets promoted. He becomes president of National University of Singapore. So that's already a reversal of the traditional pattern. But then the new twist is, I've talked about KAUST, the new Saudi university. He gets recruited by KAUST when they start up last year to become the first president of KAUST. So he's sort of, I wouldn't say he's typical, but he's emblematic of the kind of possibilities that we're seeing in this dynamic world of talent mobility. Now, you might say, well, okay, all this talent mobility is something that can be achieved by individual decisions. Students are able to, if they have a desire for these kinds of degrees and there are host universities that want them, they can make these decisions individually. The same for the faculty who are starting to move around more. But as globalization is upon us, it's a lot harder for universities as institutions to change. Universities are sort of notoriously change resistant. But in fact, what's really remarkable is that universities are beginning to change in really big ways. And I think that's because they are really anxious to keep up with this very competitive, globalized world. And this is seen in the second big trend that I've mentioned, which is this real effort to create world-class universities all over the place. And I think the central reason people are doing this is they really see, very correctly in my view, that creating great universities is just key to innovation and it's key to economic growth. And one of my favorite quotes on this is from two economists, Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz, in a book that came out a couple of years ago, The Race Between Education and Technology. And they say, as you can see, human capital embodied in one's people is the most fundamental part of the wealth of nations. And I think this is now broadly accepted. Everybody wants to create, it's become a cliche, but sometimes cliches are true. They want to create knowledge economies. They want to improve education and have the kind of societies that are going to prosper economically because of the human capital they have. And they understand that their competition is just like other areas in business. Their competition is not just local, it's not regional, it's not national, it's global. And they want to be able to compete with the best. So how are they doing this? Well, really in three ways. They're spending a lot of money. They want to be competitive, and money is the weapon that you have. So in China, billions are being spent on not only upgrading the capacity of their universities. The number of students in China, the number of students enrolled has quintupled in the past decade or so. So huge changes in capacity, but also trying to focus on quality with a much narrower set of universities that they would like to really make part of the sort of scientific elite worldwide. At the same time, in Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah started KAUST with a $10 billion endowment, which meant that it instantly had the 6th largest university endowment in the world. So spending is very important. The other thing that I've already alluded to is recruiting. One of the ways that you do this is you try and get the best talent in terms of faculty talent to your campuses. So again, China has done this in a very big way. Because they have more money from the government, because the economy is now taken off, they're trying to get Western professors, often Chinese-born professors who've gone to the West, they're trying to bring them back. And they can offer them very attractive packages. They call them sea turtles, which I'm not a Chinese speaker, unfortunately, but apparently in Chinese, sea turtle is a homonym for the word for returnee. So they're really going after the sea turtles in a big way. And the same is true of places like South Korea, has government funding to try and get Western professors. So does the National University of Singapore. So That's the second thing. And the third thing that they're doing is really trying to forge partnerships with Western universities. Singapore is probably the best example of this. As I mentioned, they want to become a global hub. They're trying to jumpstart what they already have. And well, how do you jumpstart it? You try to bring in other people who already are the best. So MIT now has a presence at the National University of Singapore. So does the University of Chicago Business School. You know, business, of course, along with the so-called STEM subjects, science and engineering and technology, business is very, very popular in foreign countries that want to benefit from Western expertise. So Singapore is bringing lots of other places as part of this sort of new ethos of competition. Now, again, I think these are fascinating and important developments, but they're causing a lot of worries, a lot of anxiety. And I think that in the West in general, and in the United States in particular, the central fear is this: we're going to lose our edge. Right now we're number one, and we may not be number one any longer. I think that when it comes to Chinese universities, Asian universities in particular, there's a sense that we are educationally threatened, that we are economically threatened. And, you know, these places are producing enormous numbers of science and engineering PhDs. And, you know, an example of this kind of anxiety came during the last presidential campaign when President Obama, at one of his campaign speeches, you know, basically said, how are we going to stay competitive when the number of PhDs in these subjects is soaring in places like South Korea and Japan and China, and it's stagnating or getting less here. And the basic view here, you know, is if others are getting ahead, we must be falling behind. Once again, you know, I think that it's perhaps understandable that there's some worry about what's happening elsewhere, but I really think that it's misguided and that we should embrace these changes. We shouldn't be afraid of them. Now, it's absolutely true that Western universities are getting a run for their money. I mean, we're just in a much more competitive environment than we have been before. But, you know, I think that we should be energized by this. We shouldn't be worried about it. And the fundamental reason, and really one of the take-home points, you know, I can't resist, you know, showing this once again, of the new book, The Great Brain Race, one of the take-home points is that increasing knowledge is not a zero-sum game. There's not a finite amount of knowledge in the world that we all have to scramble to fight over to get our piece of. If there's more smart people in China, more people with PhDs, with more education, that's good for us. It's not bad for us. And, you know, economists will talk about knowledge as a public good. It's something that can't be contained within national borders. So a lot of people, I mean, there's an economist, Tyler Cowen, there's many others who've made this point. If there's a discovery that's made in South Korea or Saudi Arabia or wherever, in the United States, we are particularly recognized for our ability to innovate, for example. And so it's entirely possible that there'll be new knowledge created someplace else, but that we'll come in and that we'll do something fascinating with it and important. We might create the next Google. So again, I think if you take a more expansive view of what's going on, you can see the opportunities that are out there. Now, I've talked about the ways in which a very highly competitive global marketplace has developed. And in my view, global education markets, just like markets in finance or in other areas, markets need information in order to function effectively. And it may be inevitable that all of this global competition, the mobility of students, competition to create world-class universities has given rise to global college rankings. And they've really proliferated in the last couple of decades, not just at the national level, but globally as well. So I'll just give you a very quick sort of view of what I think has happened with rankings. You know, the first one that I've been able to find, which for a Bay Area audience I hope will be particularly interesting, came in 1895 at the University of California at Berkeley, a then practically brand new university. And this is a chart you can see. It's a little hard to read, but this is one of the first rankings I've been able to find, and it's very cutting edge because it's a value-added ranking, which is now a very big issue today. And you'll see there's a picture of these young men. It's all men doing calisthenics outside somewhere on the Cal campus, and there's a chart trying to show the measurements of these guys. You know, their neck measurements, their chest measurements, their thigh measurements. And they compare them to a sample of these blue bloods on the East Coast at all these old established colleges, you know, Cornell and Amherst. They have a pretty impressive sample. It's 30,000 guys on the East Coast. And as you see at the beginning of this, the East Coast blue bloods, you know, they probably did a lot of working out at their prep schools, you know, who knows. They're way ahead of the California guys. But after 2 years of these calisthenics, the California guys surge ahead. So value has been added. And that's really a wonderful example of how these kinds of comparisons, albeit not in the academic realm, have been around for a long time. Now, for the next 100 years or so, there were a variety of different kinds of rankings, which I have a whole chapter in the book which gives chapter and verse, as it were. But they really did not take off until 1983, which is when my alma mater, my journalistic alma mater, U.S. News, started its college rankings. Initially, just really a beauty contest, a poll of college presidents, a fairly conventional journalistic exercise to try and figure out who do you think is the best. And they quickly became very popular. The presidents came in, they were mad, they protested, they said you have to stop, you're outside of the guild, how dare you presume to come in and judge us. And U.S. News basically said, well, okay, we'll try to make it more sophisticated, so they added a lot of measures, graduation rates, research spending, qualifications of entering students, et cetera, et cetera. The rankings continued to be hugely popular, hugely controversial, as you know. What many people don't know is how quickly the rankings spread to more than 40 countries now. Individual rankings by country, not only in places you might expect, like Italy or like Canada, but also in places like Peru or Kazakhstan, which now have their own national level rankings, because there's a huge interest in figuring out how universities compare with one another. And then the big breakthrough came 7 years ago when a Chinese university, Shanghai Jiaotong University, created its own global college rankings, looking at universities around the world. And this was very much part of China's effort to upgrade its own universities. And I think the basic feeling was, well, if you want to figure out, your goals, you got to have some kind of a benchmark, figuring out where you are, where your competition is, and where you want to go. So they created rankings that are very scientifically oriented, engineering oriented, very connected, very much based on publication, citation indexes, things like that. The following year, a British publication called Times Higher Education, they used to have the word supplement on the end, they created rankings as well, quite different, much more survey-based, both of academics and employers. They were initially more geared to consumers, but in fact, both rankings became very influential, not only with individuals who might want to figure out where to study, but also with universities and with policymakers, trying to figure out what are the most effective institutions. And for the time being, if you look at the top institutions, you could all, because I'm at Google, I can say you can all look for your alma maters on these lists. And these lists are actually pretty similar. This is the most recent set of rankings. You'll note, of course, that the British rankings seem to have a few more British universities in the list. But the top ones are pretty similar, and they may stay similar for some time to come. But I think that what is going to happen, because of some of the ferment that I've talked about, is if you go into the top 50, the top 100, we're going to see more and more new entrants and more shaking up of the way things have been. Now, as in every other area that I've touched on, there's a lot of worry about the rankings. There's a lot of concerns and a lot of criticisms. And, basically, I'll give you an example. I went to a conference in Shanghai of university officials from all over the world, and a French philosopher named Monique Canto-Sperber, who is the president of the École Normale Supérieure, which is one of the elite grandes écoles in France. She came all the way to Shanghai to give a long, impassioned speech about how terrible the Shanghai rankings are, and they use the wrong inputs, and they use the wrong measures, and they don't do justice to wonderful places like hers. And it was exactly like the discussions I used to have at U.S. News when college presidents would come in and blast us for all the dumb, terrible things that we did with the U.S. News rankings. And in this case, it was great. I was on the sidelines. It wasn't my fight, but I got to see how the same dynamic was going on. And, basically the criticism is that the rankings focus on the wrong things. They create perverse incentives, the critics will say. The Shanghai rankings have a measure of how many Nobel winners do you have on your faculty. And, one question is, well, okay, they got their Nobel 30 years ago. What does that have to do with their current research? Do they actually teach students? There are lots of reasons that might not be the ideal metric. And basically, the criticism is these rankings just don't tell you how effective universities really are. Particularly when it comes to teaching and learning, as opposed to research and things that are perhaps more easy to quantify. So in fact, places like France, they really hate the rankings. They've, people are starting to come up with their own. So another one of the French elite universities, an engineering school called Paris Mines-Tech in Paris, they came up with a global ranking, but they created it themselves. And you ended up seeing this headline in one of the web-based higher education publications. It's one of my favorite headlines. And you'll see it's French do well in French world rankings. So this is what happens when people start trying to police themselves, you might say. So, once again, I think that despite these anxieties and despite the criticisms, I think rankings are ultimately useful. And, it's absolutely true they have lots of flaws. I'm well aware of the flaws in the U.S. News rankings, the global rankings. They each have their own flaws. But I think that already, even in their flawed state, they can be useful to students, they can be useful to universities, they can be useful to policymakers, trying to get a rough sense of how different institutions are doing on certain measures, and that's particularly true as long as they're transparent. You can figure out, Shanghai rankings are particularly good in this. You can go to their website, you can look at everything, and you can redo it yourself if you think there's a better way of looking at all these factors. And I think, we have to understand that practically speaking, these rankings are here to stay. We're in the age of accountability. Everybody wants to figure out how they're doing, how everyone else is doing, how can they get ahead, and you need some way of measuring that. So I think the real challenge is going to be how to make the rankings better. Who knows? Maybe there'll be Google University rankings. That'd be a great project for a smart bunch of people like you. I think that what's encouraging is that there already are some efforts underway to improve existing rankings and to create some new ones. I mentioned Times Higher Education. Well, last fall, I wasn't going to say they fired their data firm, but I got a stern email yesterday from a guy at the data firm saying we were not fired, the contract was not renewed. So I'll say that for the record. In fact, this other company, QS, has always been a full partner in the rankings, and they are continuing with their own rankings, while Times Higher bought in Thomson Reuters, obviously a very reputable place, to revamp their rankings completely, to do it in a very transparent way. They're going around speaking about it, they're writing about it. They have not yet revealed their exact new methodology, but I think it's very encouraging because it means they've listened to the criticisms and they're trying to make things better. The other thing that's happening is places are trying new kinds of rankings, not just the French version, but the OECD, the group of industrialized nations based in Paris, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're developing something called AHELO, yet another acronym, but it has to do with higher education and learning outcomes. And they're trying to measure, really, they don't like to call it a ranking, fair enough, but it's an assessment of what's happening on campus in terms of student learning. So they're trying to see, how much do students know coming in, how good is their writing, how good are their analytical abilities, and then what they hope to do is create a value-added measure. This is down the road, but they want to see, okay, how are they coming in? How are they when they leave? How much have they improved? And they're trying to come up with cross-national comparisons that will really be valid. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think it's a really great effort, and I think that ultimately, if you could get at better measures of learning and somehow combine them with better measures of research productivity, perhaps not only in science but in other fields as well, then you'd be creating something very useful. And I think we're going down that road. So I've talked about mobility, I've talked about world-class universities, I've talked about rankings. And before I finish, I just want to reiterate that despite the anxieties we sometimes hear about each of these phenomena, I think it's absolutely crucial that we reject academic protectionism, which is a term that I use in the book, in all of its forms. As I said before, knowledge, it's not a finite resource. It's not something we have to scramble over. It's something that can grow. It's something that can benefit everybody. And I think that it's just a great opportunity for us, everything that's happening. The final thing I want to say as we look at the future of higher education is that we tend to see it, I think, in this country through a paradigm of us versus them. How are we doing? How's the rest of the world doing? Are we keeping up? Are they going to outpace us? What's going to happen in the great brain race, that I use for my title? And I think that already this model is sort of getting out of date. I've talked about the research collaborations that are growing enormously. I've talked about the partnerships that are being created. A place like Sciences Po in Paris, an elite political science school, has a partnership with the London School of Economics and with Columbia University. One could imagine in the future whole new ways of organizing universities. You might see mergers, you might see multinational universities. Already John Sexton, who's the president of New York University, he has a vision for what he calls a global network university. They are already creating a campus that's opening up in a couple of months in Abu Dhabi that's going to be sort of an elite campus of undergraduates from all around the world. And his idea is, you might start in Abu Dhabi and finish in Washington Square, their New York City campus, but they're hoping to go to Shanghai as well. And if that happens, you might start in Shanghai and finish in Abu Dhabi. So the notion of a sort of single center may no longer hold true. And we really don't know what's going to happen in the future. You could go back to the 19th century when German universities, that was where the research university was created. Americans went there. That was the state of the art. They came back. They took this idea with them. They created places like Johns Hopkins University, the University of Chicago, based on the German model of putting research and teaching under one roof, we took this idea, we ran with it. We became the best in the world, by far. Since World War II, we are the magnet, right? So now German universities have really fallen on hard times. They've had for decades a kind of egalitarian funding model where everyone became kind of equal in their mediocrity. And they just don't have great universities, with a few exceptions of some research institutes. So now, 150 years later, Germany is now looking to us to figure out how to become excellent. So things can change, and I think we have to approach the future with some humility. But, I think that whatever happens, I'm really convinced that the key to innovation and the key to economic growth is going to continue to lie in the freest possible movement of people and ideas. And that's true both in university campuses and beyond. I think it's a very exciting time, and I'm really curious to see what happens next. Thank you very much. I'd love to hear your questions.
Hi, I went to school in India, and one of the challenges that India has is that the system sort of expects the government to do all its work for them. And what it means is that the private sector has hardly invested any money in creating world-class institutions, and whatever little there is...
I'm sorry, could you speak a little bit louder?
Sure. Whatever little there is basically a for-profit organization, right? So you have all these politicians who are sort of creating their schools and in it really for the money. And it's such a big problem that the Supreme Court has intervened time and time again to sort of cap the fees and to ensure that education is more egalitarian. So my question is, how has the private sector in most other third world countries, so to speak, contributed to education in general? Or is it mostly the expectation that the government does all the job for them?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not just saying that. It really is. And in fact, I have a chapter on the role of for-profits in globalization, which I didn't get into in this sort of this smorgasbord overview presentation. But the private sector, the for-profit sector, has been very important. And I think that will continue to be the case. I mean, there are companies that we know in the United States, like the Apollo Group, which is the parent company of the University of Phoenix, Kaplan, which we think of for its tutoring programs, a number of others that are really going global in a very big way. I mean, Kaplan now, the company is much more focused on, I think the percentage of their time and energy is spent on higher education is now much greater than what they're doing in K-12, and they're going global too. So what you'll find is in places like in Latin America, in Asia, India is somewhat of a special case, as you know, because of the regulatory regime and the barriers to going into India. But they're trying to fill, well, it's really an unmet need in many countries, and it's often students or people who want to become students who are left out of traditional systems, usually state-run systems. And you sort of have the paradox in some places where there'll be an elite public university that's free, which sounds very egalitarian. But it turns out that to get into this university, you have to go to expensive secondary schools that mostly affluent people are able to afford. So it's kind of a phony egalitarianism, and what happens is there's lots of people, middle class, working class people who want to get ahead. They want to get degrees, often in very practical subjects, accounting, nursing, tourism, and so the for-profit sector is trying to provide that. And they're coming in, they're buying up they're not really setting up, the MOOC Kaplan or MOOC Laureate, but they're trying to buy up existing institutions with local brands, but to try to take advantage of their expertise to create, to go to scale and to create, sort of back office synergies and so forth. So to sort of summarize, I think there's a lot going on. I think it's going to grow very, very quickly. It's already grown a lot. Countries like India, it's tough. There's a lot of suspicion of there's a lot of worry about quality, which is understandable. The same in this country. People are suspicious of the phoenixes and so forth. But I think, look, that's never going to be the whole package, but that's going to be a component because people want different things. And, the private sector can be very nimble. I think the question is, how are you going to try to ensure some basic level of quality? But frankly, that's an issue for mainstream universities. India, as you know better than I do, it's just a tragedy. I mean, the hunger for learning in the Indian population is, it's palpable. And the capacity of the universities is completely inadequate, just in terms of numbers, and the quality of universities is completely inadequate, beyond a few elite schools, the IITs and the management institutes, the IIMs. So periodically the government will say, we're going to create dozens of new great institutions, but you can't just snap your fingers and make it happen. They often don't have the resources to do it. And right now there's a bill before India's parliament. I mean, I won't talk about India too much longer, but foreign universities would like to come in. It's a great market for them, some elites, some non-elites, and so far they've been barred completely from setting up branch campuses. So it's really been a protectionist regime. And there is a bill, there's a higher education minister who's much more open to changing things, but it's controversial. There have been questions about, will the caste quotas apply to foreign universities, and in particular, will they be allowed to repatriate money they make? So clearly for the private sector, if you can't take out profits, why are you going to go in? So I think there is a role for the private sector. I think that in a place like India, there have been huge strides made in India. I mean, certainly in the broader economy, the idea of central planning is now out of vogue, and that's why India's grown, in my view. I think you need to bring that same sort of mentality to the higher education system.
I'd like to follow on to this very interesting question, focusing on Europe, since that's where I'm from, rather than India. Italy. You mentioned how German universities in particular are in a crisis due to the very egalitarian model. That's not just Germany. Okay, France may have kept a few bright spots. Italy may have a few foreign, like there's a Texas A&M branch in Castiglione Fiorentino, John Hopkins one, just picking on a few you mentioned in Bologna, and so on. But they're really not working on a mass scale at all. The mass will tend to the same egalitarian mediocrity. And you mentioned the cultural suspicion. Well, you don't know what cultural suspicion of America is until you've been to France, which you have, of course. But compared with that, it's like, so I don't see any private sector activity. Of course, I've been living in the US for a long time now, so I may not perceive everything that's going on. But while you hold that hope for the Indias and other emerging countries, is Europe, which isn't really going to have a booming economy anytime, doesn't have anywhere as many young people, and so on, going to be able to attract any private initiative, private investment, the way you hold out for the third one?
Well, look, several things are going on in Europe which I think are encouraging. I mean, the first is that you're absolutely right. I mentioned Germany only because I was trying to make the parallel with the 19th century. However, France, like Germany, has had this problem, of and I lived there for a couple of years, and you're right. I love France, but I'm well aware of its problems. I was there during the student protests of 1986, which sort of dates me, and they were talking about how they didn't want to move to an American-style system where, as everyone knows, only the rich go to college. And this is when the student fees, were going to go from $300 a year to $350, which was going to shut out countless, tens of thousands of students. So there's a lot of misperceptions. But France is now trying to sort of go beyond this egalitarian model to create a competitive funding model that's designed precisely to create a small group of world-class institutions if they can show that they're really going to be worthy of the government funding. And the same thing is happening in Germany. So they're really trying to turn things around. Italy has a place, you probably know it better than I do, Bocconi University, which is a private university. And they have a goal, for example, of, I'm not sure how close they are, of getting half of their faculty from overseas within the next 5 or 10 years. So they are very, very globally minded. And you also have something called the Bologna Accord, which is sort of a common market in education throughout Europe, trying to create degrees that are compatible with each other, a standard 3-year degree, so it's easier to move around, it's easier for employers to assess these degrees, and you can think of it as the higher ed version of the euro, which I think is going to create some useful ability to be mobile. So I think there are some promising things going on in Europe, but you're right. I mean, Bologna is, one of the seats of the creation of universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and it's a tragedy that it no longer has that.
When the King of England wanted to establish a university in a place who had so little distinction that the best thing it was known for was that the river was so shallow that even an oxen could ford, what he did was go right to Bologna and steal the top academicians. There's was a lot of that going around in the Middle Ages as well.
That's right.
I'm from Bologna, so that's why I'm so knowledgeable about that.
I understand. Okay.
Hi there. What is the role of the internet to help flatten the world and make for the fluid transfer of information and people virtually at least in all of this?
Gosh, well, I'm going to wrap myself on the knuckles for not getting to that sooner. You can't cover everything. Again, there's a lot of that in the book.
This is Google.
Sure, the internet is very important, and I think that we're still in we're in a period of experimentation. MIT has what they call the open courseware system, where they're putting all their courses on the web. Although the president of Yale, there's a certain amount of trash talking. He says, well, yeah, they're up on the web, but most of them are just skeleton courses. They're sometimes it's a syllabus, sometimes it's more than that. Yale has far fewer courses, but they're much more fully built out, with video and podcasts and so forth. So there are sort of questions about how you do it. The for-profits are also doing this in a very big way. I think some very high percentage of Chinese students studying in Australian universities, a very high percentage are doing it online. And you get into questions of what's the best model, fully online or a combination of, they call it blended learning, sometimes they call it click and brick, where you'll go, like with Phoenix, you'll go right by the freeway exit, because that's where they'll put their sites, because it's easy for working students, that's their population. You might go periodically to have some classroom time and some face time, and then a lot of it you'll do whenever it's good for you on your computer. Clearly that has huge potential across borders. I think that not everyone's going to want that. We're going to have, we already have a variety of models. If you look at this country, I think that's one of our great strengths, from the for-profit sector, small but growing fast, the open access community colleges, the state universities, from the Berkeleys and the UCLAs to the Cal States, East Bay or San Francisco. And there's a different entry point for lots of people, and some of it's going to be online, and some of it's going to be traditional, and some people will sit around a tree reading Thucydides, which is great. I mean, I'm all for it. And in fact, the Asian universities are very interested in our liberal arts tradition, because although we tend to admire, their ethos of of work and perseverance, and so forth, they look at us and they say, what's the secret sauce that makes the United States so innovative? And one of the answers may be that people learn certain habits of mind, of questioning what they're taught, and it's a cliche, but thinking outside the box. So, I mean, to come back to online learning, I think that people are going to be trying to grapple with ways to figure out what's the optimal kind of learning experience, and I think that online, for some people, is going to be a part of that.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for coming to Google.
Thank you for having me.
Sure.